Saint Giles Files.
Hi folks, welcome to today's episode of the St Giles Files. This week I'm actually holding the object we'll be discussing today, which is pretty exciting. In previous episodes it's either been a very conceptual object or an object that is very, very high up. But today I'm going to be presenting entry tickets to the Thistle Chapel. So I came across these during an archiving project and they got me thinking about how St Giles has grown into its role as a heritage site over the years. For reference, these tickets are sadly undated, but they cost a 3p each, so I guess anywhere between the mid-1500s and 1970, if that narrows it down for anyone. I did do a little bit of detective work and found a description of a ticket from 1888 that perfectly matched this ticket. However, my tickets allowed the bearer entry to the Thistle Chapel, which was not completed until 1911. So I think we can safely assume it was issued after this point, but it does show that there was already a long continuity of using the cathedral as something of a tourist site. We know there was a charge to enter the cathedral in the 1880s. There is a pretty fiery debate on the subject in an 1883 Scotsman article. Certainly Edinburgh was becoming an increasingly fashionable city. George IV had visited in 1822. I think he was the first monarch to do so since Charles II's coronation in 1651. So he was proving that Scotland was safe again and was a possible tourist destination for anyone interested. And Walter Scott was of course there to introduce some Scottish romanticism into popular culture. Those coming to St Giles in the 1880s seemed pretty patriotic. One disgruntled observer in the Scotsman complained, "Had the celebrated colours ever experienced anything worse than this?" He's regarding the mass of people crowding into the building and referencing the military colours, some of which we still have now, but there are a lot more of them in the building at the time that he's talking about. Tickets could also be obtained for certain events, such as a royal visit to the cathedral in 1903, which required a pass to enter. So over the years, St Giles has not been immune to the increase in Edinburgh tourist traffic, and we have tried to do plenty to welcome them. We have a dedicated team of volunteer guides there to welcome and give tours. They know absolutely everything about St Giles. I learned everything about the building from them. I learned everything about Scottish and Edinburgh history from them. I think I would learn everything about everything I know from them in general. However, there is a tendency to see tourism as a fairly modern phenomenon, and certainly cheap travel has made a difference, but people from out of town have been coming to St Giles for centuries to look around, to admire the architecture as part of a pilgrimage. There's lots of reasons, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how Jess and Stephen discuss ideas of tourism and heritage, and I'm sure you are too. So without further ado, let me pass over to them.
Thanks for that intro, Kira. Very, very clear and concise. Just to update our listeners, Jess is incredibly busy, so you're going to have to make do with me and Kira instead of Jess. But given that Kira gave us such a great intro, I know she's prepared a few points off the back of that, which we'll discuss. This episode is going to be more of a discussion, I think, is it, Kira, rather than us necessarily presenting fact and then analysing that fact. I think it'll be more of us analysing ideas a bit more, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is going to be quite a sort of discussion-led podcast, but considering you've had to listen to Stephen and I go at each other's throats for a few, then maybe that's a nice thing.
Yeah, and it'd be really nice actually, especially for this one. It might be the case that the episode after this, we do a bit of listener-led stuff. So if anyone does have any thoughts, ideas, questions, then it might be that I or Kira does a bit of editing together of your thoughts on things. So yeah, do send them in. So let's kick off with this. So one of the things that you didn't mention in your intro, Kira, which as soon as you said entry ticket, this really flagged it for me, partly because I was doing a clear out of my drawers recently and I came across loads of tickets for different things. And I don't know how many people do save tickets to things, but pretty much anything that I've enjoyed going to, I save the ticket. But I assume for a lot of people, especially for maybe if you're visiting somewhere, I wouldn't necessarily save a ticket for if I was just out and about visiting. But I think it's really interesting that this has been saved, that somebody maybe thought it was worth saving, or maybe didn't think it was worth saving, just put it in their pocket or their purse and then took it home, and then eventually someone found it in the back of a cupboard or something. But now it's become history and it's become a valuable object, kind of by dint of the fact that it's been saved for, well, however many years, 80 years, 100 years, whatever it is. But also, I suppose, in that it's something that no longer exists. I wonder if there was still tickets to the Thistle Chapel, it'd still be valuable to us, I think. But now that it's a scarce thing as well, I think it gains value in that sense. But I suppose also for us, it's more valuable as staff at St Giles, because you think, oh God, that used to happen here. That doesn't happen here anymore. Isn't that funny? And I suppose most of the things, people would just throw them away. You know, it's okay, I'm going into the Thistle Chapel, buy ticket, use ticket, done. Throw it away. Whereas for whatever reason, this person kept their ticket. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, especially in the current era where tickets seem to be disappearing a bit, where most of your tickets are on your phone. So let's say 100 years from now, they might not have tickets in the same way from this era as we do from that era. So I think that's an interesting thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
It's funny because I never thought about it in that way, and I wonder if that is because, being like a true millennial, every ticket I've had for the last like 5 years has been on my phone, and I don't really tend to keep objects in the same way. And I think looking at it from the perspective of someone who's been doing a lot of archiving recently, a lot of what I look at, you never really know quite how it's come into my possession almost. And I think the entry ticket is such a good example of that, because so much of what I look at is quite academic, is sort of, I don't know, photocopies of a book or similar. And this one is such a human piece of such a human archival document, which I really like. And I think it, as I said in the intro, it kind of allows us to think about how St Giles has been operating over the years, and it just feels like a nice little piece of history that is very easy to sort of pin onto a person's experience.
Yeah, I think that's it for me, because in my my parents' house, in my bedroom, I had this wall of tickets of things that I'd done, and it was hooking memories on, because I knew who I went with, when I went, well, obviously how much it cost to send the ticket, but what I'd done that day. And whilst, you know, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the date was unless it said on the ticket, which I think is, well, pointless, whatever the date was. It's more about the memories of I remember doing that thing. And I think that's the interesting thing with the ticket, which I suppose, might be lost. But then that was just my first thought, that it is a piece of ephemera that it's nice that we've kept. But
I know you've done a little bit of research in terms of kind of the economics of the ticket, so how much it would have cost, and maybe that will allow us.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was leading this was leading into your points as to kind of who uses a ticket and who our visitor demographic is. And being the economic historian I am, I immediately thought, Kira said it was 3p. I wonder what 3p means, because I suppose, you know, everyone always rails against the castle for being 16 or 18 pounds, and that's a huge percentage of someone's daily income or weekly income, and relatively it's so expensive. So yeah, and as I have done in previous podcasts as well, I headed straight for the internet as to how much this was worth. And I also actually, I suppose, just before I tell you do the big reveal of how much it's worth, I thought it was quite interesting to look at who was coming in, because whatever we say about the castle, whether their charge is because they need to reduce footfall or whatever it is means testing their visitors. Because, you know, let's say someone who isn't on a huge income might say, for a family of 4, nope, that's going to be too much. We can't go and we can't absorb that bit of history. So I was interested to see who might have been barred from coming into the chapel. So anyway, 3p, as is always in the modern era, it's the Big Mac index. So how much can you buy a Big Mac for around the world? That's the kind of the thing that we compare our money to. In the olden days, obviously, pint of beer.
Oh, you know, quite right, as it should be.
The everyman monetary figure, the pint of beer. So 3p was the cost of our ticket, Kira. How much was a pint of beer?
I'm closing my eyes because I can't see the shared document that we have about information. Was it 5 pence?
It was 5 pence.
Oh my gosh, I honestly didn't know that. I promise.
I love that you said I'm closing my eyes, because that is just for me. Nobody listening would have any concept of whether you were or weren't. But 5p, which, so basically it's cheaper to come into St Giles Thistle Chapel than it was to buy a beer. Now, I think you'll be really, despite the price of Edinburgh beer these days, which is a whole different podcast from this one, but it's about £4, and I think you'll be really pushed to find a tourist attraction for cheaper than £4. I know we used to suggest £2 and then £3 for a donation for the chapel. So I mean, again, roughly, I suppose the same discrepancy as is here, between the pint of beer and the cost. But the average, so the lowest weekly wage, I googled loads of different weekly wages. I should say, actually, sorry, I don't think I've said this. This is from 1925. So Kira gave us a bit of an intro as to when she thought the ticket was from, and I think I'd agree. Probably just after the First World War. 1925 was the easiest year for me to find all this data, so this is the year I chose. The lowest weekly average wage was a farm labourer, and they would earn 210p a week. Now, obviously, it wasn't written 210p, but I decided just to convert it. It's imperial, so I wanted to make sure everything sounded easy to digest. So 210p a week. So 3p out of that, nothing. So I think that whoever the St Giles authorities were making sure that everyone could come and see the chapel, and possibly just trying to make a bit of kind of keep the thing going money on the side. Any thoughts on that?
First of all, I really like that beer used to be the sort of touchstone of how much your money, because that's how I do it today. Every time I get my paycheck, I'm like, all right, I can buy X amount of beer. That's not true.
Then you buy it.
And then I buy it. And I guess it might be nice now to talk about why people were coming into St Giles. It may not have been enough money, but why did people feel like they wanted to give that percentage of their income? Like, what were they going to get out of it? There's a few kind of reasons that I was thinking about people might come to St Giles. So maybe I could talk about that a bit and we could have a bit of a discussion about it. I'm aware that Stephen has a couple of years more experience than I do in St Giles, so he might well have some sort of information that I haven't heard yet.
We'll have to see.
Maybe not. Maybe I'm setting you up. So the one that actually came to my head first is a reason that people come to St Giles that I think actually sometimes gets forgotten in the sort of heritage side of things. Not that we forget, but when people think of St Giles as a tourist site, this might not be the first thing that comes to mind. And that is the idea of pilgrimage to St Giles. And I think it's interesting because Scotland has such a long history of pilgrimages. Perhaps the most famous would have been to St Andrews, and you have the Fife Way pilgrimage that I know is actually sort of revived in 2019, so it's still something that people are doing. And you also had various pilgrimages to like the Orkney and Shetland Isles as well, and it's still something. And Iona, yeah, of course, the big one. There was a very interesting guidebook that I found in the archives that would have been written in the early 2000s, and it was written by the very Reverend Hilary Smith. So she wrote this book, and it is essentially like a guidebook you would find anywhere, but it has different appropriate prayers and sort of contemplations for various parts of St Giles. So you stand in the Albany Isle, which is where the memorials are, and you think about sort of ideas of sacrifice and that sort of thing. There's also a really nice quote that I found. I was doing a little Instagram post about Robert Louis Stevenson, and he has a really nice quote that says, "Edinburgh is a city of churches as though it was a place of pilgrimage." And I'm thinking, well, it is a place of pilgrimage, and St Giles is very much a part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think maybe 2 years ago, there was an idea of having a modern pilgrimage and creating a map in Edinburgh, and I think possibly of Scotland, of where one could, I don't know what the verb of pilgrimage is, where one could pilgrimage to, I'm going to say. But it never came to anything, I don't think. And for some reason, first of all, I think St Giles is very lucky in the fact that we get more tourists than we can handle for the most part. So the idea of pilgrimage maybe passes us by in that, yeah, we don't think we need any more visitors, but possibly we should be doing more on that. But then also, I suppose somehow, and this is purely a personal thing, somehow pilgrimage doesn't seem like a Presbyterian idea to me for some reason, for whatever it is, when it definitely is, because we get tons of Americans who come to St Giles and they say, oh, I wanted to come and see, whether it's Montrose or I wanted to come and see the home of Presbyterianism. But for some reason, yeah, pilgrimage, it doesn't seem to feature in my ideas quite in the same way that it should, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's something I thought about as well, because American Presbyterian faith tours do seem to make up the bulk
Yeah.
of the pilgrims that we get. Uh, Although I don't think pilgrimages necessarily have to be overtly religious. So even if it is not
Yeah.
something that is quite as in vogue in Presbyterianism as it is in, say, like Catholicism.
And I think for St Giles, though, I do think there's a lot of genealogical pilgrimage. I mean, the amount of people that are related to Montrose, so that's James Graham, and they come in and say, "I'm a Graham. Where's this Graham?" And I think there's tons of that, and especially as genealogy seems to have been becoming more and more important with all the DNA tests. Yeah, I think especially Scotland, probably Ireland, and to some degree England will have a lot more genealogical pilgrimage from the English speaking world, which I think St Giles is a large part to play. And then we get tons of emails from people saying, "Help me find my relatives. I've been Googling them and they were christened in 1912 or whatever." So yeah. You've seen this here, but one of my favourite episodes, and I have my friend Gav to thank for this, that have you seen Who Do You Think You Are?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I suppose it's been on for years now, and I watched the first couple of series and then I hadn't seen it for ages. And then Gav told me about this episode with Danny Dyer. And I think they know from the first step that Danny Dyer he's kind of taking it a bit tongue in cheek. So he ends up finding out in this really dramatic scene in Westminster Abbey, he unveils this scroll and he finds out that he's related to Richard III, I think. Now I decided, again, with my kind of bias towards finding the numbers of the situation, Richard III will have had 16 million descendants now. So there's probably 1/5 of the population that's related to Richard III.
Just to give some credit to overseas visitors who do come on sort of family fact-finding trips, I think living on such a small island, you kind of assume that you are related to everyone, and it's very easy to be like, "Oh, big deal, like, yeah, we're also all related to Charlemagne, like, what's the point?" But at the same time, I've had some really kind of lovely experiences with people, yet again, particularly from America, who come over, and I really like the idea that St Giles can be part of a journey to sort of understand a bit more about where they've come from.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. Yeah.
Even if sometimes it can be difficult, because I'm like, no, I don't know. I don't have no idea who your great 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 grandfather who came over on a boat from Kerry is, but it's still a nice.
Yeah, I think if you take anything, it's nice that there is a nice association with St Giles. I think, yeah. I really like the idea. So you've written educational reasons for visiting. What was your thinking on that one?
Well, I guess this is leaning more towards sort of true heritage, in a way that perhaps a pilgrimage might not be so much, sort of in terms of, as we talked about before at length, and as I'm sure people are aware, St Giles very much stands like the epicenter of a lot of Scottish history, especially the Reformation. For instance, we have a lot of school tours come in who are doing the Reformation, and so are coming to St Giles to kind of see it in the flesh, as it were. And so it kind of got me thinking about how we as a department, but also like we as a city, use St Giles and perhaps similar buildings to kind of, and this is a massively overused phrase and I'm going to do little air quotes, make history come alive, And so I think like I said, you've been here for a bit longer than me, a bit more about the sort of educational side of things, because we have unis come in, we have local schools come in, we have overseas schools come in as well. Like, what are your thoughts on that, really?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose when you proposed the idea of the entry ticket, this was an area that I hadn't even thought of at all. But now I really like the idea of this person coming in, and we can guess at their agenda, but we have no idea what it was. And so, yeah, they might have been going on a pilgrimage, or yeah, they might have really, really wanted to see. They might have never seen the architecture of Thistle Chapel, so they've bought this ticket and they've gone in, and they're trying to educate themselves or enjoy the Thistle Chapel in any way that they can. Yeah, I really like that. And given that we get so many groups in the chapel in the summer, they could just be one of that group, or they could be a kind of a 9-year-old kid that's come with their school, or they could just be on their own, just having a little look around. And I think actually the thing that you haven't put here is just coming for a sit down and a bit of quiet, which I really like the idea. I mean, I suppose it's a bit cheeky for us to have asked for 3p for someone to come and sit down and enjoy the quiet. But yeah, I like the idea that maybe they knew that the chapel was a really nice place just to sit and have a bit of time to themselves and have a bit of meditate maybe, and so they've just had to sit down.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I will say, if they're going into the Thistle Chapel itself to have a sit down, they will be sorely disappointed because you're not allowed to sit in any of the stalls.
Yeah, that's a good
There's
point.
one seat, and that's where I like to sit. So they're not. They're going to be a bit
Don't
disappointed
come
there.
in.
Yeah, yeah. But I see what you mean in the sense that it can just be a place of reflection. And I think that is certainly something that I've become more aware of in my time working, that sometimes actually the heritage and the tourist side of it does need to take a backseat if it means facilitating someone coming in and using the cathedral for its primary purpose. So a lot of the time I'll send people to the chambers aisle because it's quite quiet and closed off, and it gives you a sort of moment of peace. So I think that can be interesting, especially in the summer, trying to juggle that with thousands and thousands of people who all want to come in and take pictures and kind of use it for a different purpose.
Although I think when you say it needs to take a back seat, I think I disagree with that slightly, in that, and this I suppose is a very personal thing, in that the way I find to reflect is often to appreciate how small I am relatively to things. So the fact that there is this history and heritage, I think, helps me reflect, because I can say, oh, well, you know, no matter if I've had a bad day, this building's seen however many days it's seen over 1,000 years, my bad day doesn't really matter, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good thing, the kind of like solace and insignificance, I think they call it.
Yeah. So moving on from that, I think one of the things, after I had a quick read over your notes, that I really thought was interesting as well was the change in our demographic. So whilst we're looking at people's agendas, maybe who are these people as well? And maybe that colours their agenda, because certainly we've done a lot of surveying of our visitors over the last 2 years, and we found out that between 70 and 80% of our visitors are non-UK based. And one would assume that in 1925 or whatever year it was around there, that was completely the opposite, that, you know, 80 to 90% were UK based, I would guess. I mean, that's a complete guess, I have no idea. And so do you think that changes the agenda? Because I would guess we get a lot of, well, no, I know we get a lot of Italian and Spanish visitors. And I wonder how much they are coming for a religious experience, or they like visiting cathedrals. I wonder, what do you think? Has the agenda changed based on the international visitors?
Well, I said in the intro that it seemed like people in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s were coming for quite patriotic reasons, certainly based on the sort of newspaper articles and similar that I could find on it. So they were coming in specifically for services which tended to have a much more military presence to them than they do now. So they might have come in to see like members of the Black Watch or similar, and they were coming in to see military colours. We, like I said, we still have some military colours, but certainly not to the extent that we did then. And they are perhaps, people are still interested in them, but they rarely come in to see them specifically. So I think that has shifted a lot. Of course, if you've got more local people coming in, they're going to have more kind of local patriotic thoughts. So it sort of follows. And I guess there's probably more, genealogy now than there would have been then.
Yeah, definitely.
I wonder, I think that St Giles, like all large tourist sites in Edinburgh, suffers slightly from the whole kind of list aspect of tourism. You know, if you're getting bussed in for a day, which is absolutely fine, but if you're doing a sort of a bus tour around Scotland, you've got one day in Edinburgh, you're going to hit up like, I don't know, Holyrood Palace, Greyfriars Bobby, the castle, and St Giles, exactly. So I think in that sense, sometimes it can suffer a bit from, you go and you have a look around and you say you've done it, which perhaps maybe wouldn't so much have been the case when we had a much larger demographic that was UK based.
See, I don't know. I would wonder about that, because I would wonder, you hear about because bus tours would have still been a thing, well, maybe not in 1925, but certainly kind of whistle stop tours around Scotland, you can imagine, would have been a thing, because people wanted to head up to the Highlands. So I wonder if there is a similarity there or not. I mean, we are purely and utterly speculating, I suppose, but I don't know.
I mean, I guess the thing is, this is our podcast. We can speculate until the cows come home if we like.
Exactly. I think we had at least 50% extraterrestrials coming in the 30s.
Yeah, I agree. And we've got at least one who stayed, because we've got ET by the shop. So that's proof if you ever needed it.
We should explain ET, I think. E.T. is a grotesque from the 12th century that's been wedged in the stone. Actually, the city archaeologist claimed that it was his property, but I said, well, we wedged it in our stone, so, tough. But it looks like E.T. from the eponymous film. So
But I will say, sorry.
No.
I will say that one slightly sad, this is kind of to do with educational trips, I guess, but I have occasionally taken a school group round and mentioned E.T. And the younger they are, the less likely they are to know. I mean, E.T. came out before I was born as well, I think, but I very much know who he is. And sometimes it's just not a reference they get, which
you say sometimes. I say every time. If you take around any primary school group now, they are not going to know who E.T. is. I even just stopped saying it. The last group I did was a couple of years ago for a school group, and I just thought, there's no point. They're not going to know. Won't say it.
Yeah, it's true. Maybe we need to find a sort of updated alien reference.
Yeah.
But none come to mind. If you have any thoughts, email us, and we'll change the script a bit.
So one of the things you've written here as well, just to move things on a little bit, is our favourite stories. And Kira, here's what I want you to do. Let's hypothesize that everyone had a ticket coming in. Who is your favourite ticket holder ever?
Oh my gosh, that's so hard. And I actually wrote this down and then didn't even think about it. So this is really going to be off the hoof. Who's my favourite ever? Okay, so I have one favourite woman that I think about a lot. And I'll do one that's kind of funny and one that was genuinely like quite a sort of moving experience to have with somebody. So the funny one is that quite early into my time at St. Giles, and I think you might have been in the building for this, so you might remember it as well. This woman came in, oh my God, truly an icon, came in, sat kind of near the back, and just opened like a huge box of takeaway pizza. And just with no shame, like the audacity of it was breathtaking. And just like started eating it and kind of looking around, and like she was clearly enjoying the building as a piece of architecture. It was a really weird one to approach because she was so confident in doing it. Yeah, she was what I remember well.
Yeah. What I wanted to point everyone to, I think on our Instagram we have the people of St. Giles, and one of our volunteers has talked about his favorite interaction, which was with a guy from Korea who wanted to. So we have a war memorial book, which is all the names of Brits that died in the Korean War. And this guy must have heard of the book, and he came to see it. And the volunteer in question said it was a really emotional moment just seeing this guy kind of interacting with this book and thanking the volunteer, obviously not thanking him, but just kind of thanking him in placeholder of these people that he wanted to thank. And I think that is one of the things that is really great about St. Giles. People can have such an emotive, evocative moment when they're there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is very true of this lady who came in. She was maybe in her 80s or 90s, and she was looking for the consecration marks. It took me a while to work out exactly what she meant, but she's looking for the consecration marks, of which we have 2 in the cathedral. So we found them, and she was kind of quite interested. And I asked her, is there a particular reason why you were looking for them? And she pulls out this book, and it turned out that her husband had passed away very recently, and he had written all of these notes about different places in Edinburgh. And this is like a big volume, and it was one of many apparently. And just because he was interested, and so she was kind of going around with this notebook and finding all the references. And it made me really emotional because it just showed that St. Giles is such a part of people's lives if they've lived in Edinburgh for a long time, and just to be part of that experience and journey for her was really nice. Yeah.
And again, I think it goes back to what we were saying, in that, to some degree you could say she's on a personal pilgrimage of sorts, just following her husband around. And I think that's a really, really a lovely idea, and a lovely kind of, I've never heard of that reason for visiting St. Giles before, and there's this plethora of reasons to visit. And I think that one is such a niche one, but also such an important one, and such a great one to have that's happened. Yeah. Oh, that was lovely.
Yeah, it was really nice. I remember. Yeah, I think the great thing about working in heritage is that you are kind of privileged enough to be privy to a lot of those moments, and it makes moments where the wave of tourists kind of becomes quite overwhelming, it sort of makes it worth it, I've found.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Is there anything that for you that you still, any potential ticket holders that stick in your mind?
Not that I can think of. I think, unfortunately, all my favourite ones are other people's stories, because I remember there's a Saturday volunteer, and I'm avoiding saying names because I wouldn't want to call people out on this and have them flooded in for. But there's a Saturday volunteer who is one of the most intelligent people I have ever met. And she is the wittiest person. It's so funny. I'm sure, well, as I start telling this story, Kira's going to know exactly who I mean. But supposedly what happened one Saturday was that this guy who claimed to be a Satanist, although I think, having kind of done a very brief read up of Satanism, I think he didn't realize quite that he wasn't a Satanist. I think he was a devil worshipper rather than a true Satanist. But anyway, and he came in with pentagrams all over him and came up to the desk and said, "Does this offend you?" And she said, "Well, no, actually, we welcome everyone at St. Giles." And then she proceeded to give him a lecture on worshipping the devil and Satanism for about 10 or 15 minutes. Bearing in mind, she would know an awful lot more than he would about his subject. And then she said, "So, how was that then?" And apparently he just said, "Oh, right, okay," and just walked out.
Oh,
So,
brilliant. I know exactly who you're talking about.
yeah, and I think it's such a great thing that, especially because there's so many of our volunteers who I love and I think are just fantastic people. And I just love the idea that this man had come in and had wanted a reaction and had aimed for a reaction, and then had just got a lesson in his own kind of belief, faith. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that maybe this is a good like St. Giles top tip. If you come into the cathedral, I would be very wary about trying to like call any of the volunteers out on historical knowledge or kind of one up them, because it's pretty humiliating when they set you right. It's happened to me. So I
Yeah.
would proceed with caution. Obviously they're so lovely, but I would be careful because they really know what they're talking about. We kind of touched on this earlier, and it might be something interesting to come back to just as a good example. I was thinking about this sort of international demographic, and it might be nice to talk about Burns and Beyond as a
Yeah.
sort of recent example of how we've catered to international audiences and how international audiences have responded. So the sort of specifics of Burns and Beyond in 2020 was that it was Burns Night, which is the celebration of Robert Burns, who's sort of Scotland's national most kind of beloved poet. And that fell on the Chinese or the Lunar New Year in 2020. So Burns and Beyond was kind of about taking these two important cultural events and sort of merging them as a citywide exhibitions of culture. There was live music. There was a Burns and Beyond trail that you could do one night where you go to all these different historical sites, St. Giles included, and we had this sort of light show and this soundscape and all of these lanterns. But we, as St. Giles, also did our sort of own side of it as well. And there were two main parts of it, I guess. And one of them was what we called the Hame tree. So Hame being Scots for home. And the idea is that people write what home or Scotland or kind of anything that feels right means to them. And then they pin it on this tree. It was all quite arts and crafts. And Hazel, who was our excellent colleague, did a fantastic job of making it. And so we had these hundreds and hundreds of these sort of leaves, as it were. And we also had a map of the world, and we encouraged people to sort of push a pin into where they had come from, be that where home was for them now, where their family was from, whatever felt appropriate. So suddenly we had all this amazing raw data about where people were coming from and about their association with Scotland. And it was a bit of the response was amazing. It's like, I remember we were almost the victims of our own success because people were so desperate to make these connections and to sort of get involved with this idea of cultural roots and all of that. So that was really great.
And I think interesting that actually I hadn't thought about the tree as an object in the same sense as it's not dissimilar to the ticket, I suppose, that, you know, it's a piece of paper that maybe someone didn't think would necessarily last for that long, although we have kept all the leaves because they were so fantastic and really, I think, made us feel quite kind of good. But yeah, I think that they're not dissimilar and maybe gave us a bit of a hint towards what some people's agenda for visiting was, whether it be to light a candle for a family member or traveling through, you know, if it was in a different language that we couldn't necessarily read, we assumed it was a tourist possibly. So yeah, I think that's quite a really nice thing to bring up.
I've just found it really exciting to think about how St. Giles was facilitating these conversations that people were having with themselves, and also the wider Burns and Beyond event. It wasn't just us, but I think as Edinburgh becomes an increasingly international city, it's important to create spaces for international people to feel welcome. And I think sometimes there can be a little bit of gatekeeping when it comes to sort of maintaining historic or heritage sites in Edinburgh. I'm sure it's true elsewhere as well. So that it felt like it was an important kind of move for the city and for us to make in that regard.
And I think it's certainly something that we as a cathedral are trying to push, to remove any barriers to people, especially locals, feeling that St. Giles isn't for them, because it definitely is. And we're trying to put new stuff on all the time to make sure that everyone feels that there is something new for them. Because obviously, if you've lived in in Edinburgh for 60 years and been in every once a year, it might seem that it's looked the same for a while. But yeah, once we get back to it, hopefully we'll have some new things, and especially Burns and Beyond, which we're hoping, I think, will come back in different forms in the future. So yeah.
There is I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to talk about, but I don't know if you've seen at the bottom of the notes, there's a really great set of quotes that I would like to say, because we've kind of touched a little bit on the idea of St. Giles being a secular site as well as a faith site. And there are lots of historic examples of this. So for instance, there used to be a police station in St. Giles, and it used to be where the Maiden was stored, which is kind of the precursor to the guillotine. And even today we use it for secular music events and similar. So it is increasingly becoming this sort of space, and we try and stop people eating their lunch in it, because it's not like a train station waiting room. But you know, sometimes you can only do so much, and so people do come to sort of sit, to take a moment, to chat with friends, to use it as you would any kind of large public space in the centre of town. And while I was looking through the archives, I found these two great quotes sort of in that vein, and I wanted to read them. So one is from William Chambers, of course, our favourite person. And so he says, "In the palmiest of its pre-Reformation days, St. Giles had a certain dash of secularism. It was in some ways a sort of public exchange, and after the clearance of the Reformation, St. Giles was still haunted for business transactions. The Earl of Murray's tomb was used to make bargains or discharge obligations." So this idea that at some point St. Giles was actually like a town meeting place for people. And then this next account made me laugh, which is maybe unfair on poor Father Alexander Bailey, who was a Catholic prior of the Benedictine community, and he was visiting from Germany. He came in 1622, and he was outraged at the way St. Giles was being used. I think he went in imagining it would have a sort of quite monastic feel to it. But as we said before, St. Giles is in the centre of town, and so he says this, he says, "The restless resorting of people, treating their worldly affairs, some writing, some making obligations, contracts, discharges, too many, alas, about drinking and courting of women, yea, and perhaps worse than I can even imagine."
Yeah.
Which I don't think we have any more, to be fair.
Yeah. Interesting, though, because one assumes, is Catholic. Yeah. And prior to the Reformation, we're told that people would have been contracts before a written contract was necessarily in vogue or even accepted. People would make contracts on an altar, and it would be a kind of a religiously bound thing. So it's interesting that he's now horrified by that, given that it was very much a Catholic idea that the church would ratify contracts.
Yeah, you do wonder how much of it was him kind of doing a bit of a job on the idea of this sort of unholy Presbyterian space where people were just using it as you would use any alehouse, or whatever his motive might have been. And I know that prior and just after the Reformation, I think this is Rosalind K. Marshall book, where she talks about the problem of people like discharging rifles and that sort of thing if they got particularly annoyed by a service. So even though it gets pretty loud during the Fringe, I think we have dealt with the issue of gun control in St. Giles, which is good. I think we've kind of talked quite a lot about the different ways that St. Giles might be used by people. Is there anything else that you...
Yeah, I really like those quotes to end on, especially the Chambers' use of some sort of public exchange, which I still think it kind of is. So yeah, maybe we should just wrap up there.
So before we go, we'd like to say, as always, thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate it. And we will also say that St Giles during this time has been absolutely brilliant about keeping all of its staff on. And in doing so, allows us to do all of these great side projects, of which the podcast is one. So if you would like to donate some money to keep us going, that would be much appreciated. And the link is below this podcast, so you can go there.
Brilliant.